Hello, hello. I am welcome to the live stream. So this will just be a chill Q&A. If you have any questions for either me or Matt, feel free to drop them in. Super chats will have priority, but also at the same time, I'm not going to demand for 50 super chats of $100. If you know who I'm referring to, you know who I'm referring to. But I'm joined today by my buddy Matt Hedges. If you want to introduce yourself, Matt, and a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thanks for having me on, Michael. I'm a reform guy on Twitter. Some of y'all may have seen me around on there. Matt J Hedges 11 is my tag on Twitter or X. I kind of get mixed. I just call it whatever. I blog a little bit online about theology, church history, sometimes scholastic stuff, things like that I'm interested in. I'm especially big on reformed retrieval of the 16th and 17th century Protestant scholastic tradition, and just the general overall study of theology and apologetics.
All righty. So I did leave the in the description. I left a link to Matt's channel. So if you want something of the more reformed tradition, I would warn for Catholics, like you should be well read in your tradition before you look into like the more sophisticated understandings of other Protestant traditions. So you should be well versed within the Catholic tradition. I just have to put that as a warning. Nothing personal, Matt, but
Oh, I understand. No, I get it.
but at the same time, yeah. So I kind of first wanted to talk to you about I guess so you recently put out a video on Christology.
hmm
And I guess my first question to you, and I kind of noticed this in your intro, is what would be your approach? It seems as of late, right? You see a lot of perhaps not as well read apologists when it comes to Christology, when it
hmm
comes to the issue of Christ knowing the hour in his human intellect, where you see, I know you mentioned like Muslim apologists
Yeah.
calling out Christians for being not being aware of this or being ignorant of it, not trying to
hmm
put a pun here. So I guess what would be your approach when it comes to arguing against a Muslim on this specific topic? And do you think that it is more convincing exegetically from Scripture to admit ignorance of the hour in Christ's human intellect, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Well, it would when it comes to arguing with a Muslim, it kind of depends on what type I'm arguing with. First of all. If it's a Jake the Muslim metaphysician type that has some understanding of like scholastic stuff, then I would want to talk about the whole threefold distinction of Christ's human knowledge into beatific, infused, and acquired knowledge. I would kind of start there. However, if they were looking for a quick and simple answer, I would say, and I would argue, and I argued, of course, that this I think was the earlier patristic interpretation was that um, that the sayings of Christ in the Gospels, some are befitting of the divinity, others are befitting of the humanity, but they are both predicated of one person, God
Right.
incarnate, right? Contra Nestorius. And so we want to say that, yes, like with respect to the humanity, Christ does not know the day or the hour. Although you could also perhaps um, kind of combine that together with the reading of Christ not declaring the day and the hour. So those aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. I don't necessarily see a need to put a division there.
Okay.
Um, but it seems more exegetically convincing and patristically convincing, in my view, to admit that, yes, Christ did not know the day or the hour in his humanity, or at least maybe with respect to the infused or acquired knowledge.
Okay. So would you be willing to like so usually when it comes to arguing that Christ does know the hour in his human intellect, you kind of have two main arguments, right? You have St. Basil's argument that Christ in Mark 13, he's basically kind of almost in a sense referring to the fact that his knowledge he receives from the Father, right? As
Mhm.
opposed to like kind of like the passages that he'll also talk about, our Lord will talk about like in John 6, right? Everything that the Father does, I've, received that
Right.
in the communication of essence? Or would you find Gregory the Great's argument more convincing that is purely on the level of a declaration?
I'd find Basil a little more convincing in that specific regard. Um, I think the Cappadocians in general, of course, are going to understand things highly in terms of the Trinitarian relations, including
Right.
because for them, the oikonomia, the economy, mirrors the eternal relations in God, paternity, filiation, spiration. And so the ad extra things of God mirror that. And that's how they even argue for the Trinity in the first place, is to say that the unity of the divine work, the divine action in the world, proves the unity of the divine essence. But like I said, when it comes to specifically the issue of the day and the hour, it seems that the earlier interpretation, including like Athanasius, Gregory, Nazianzus, and Ambrose, those are three that I talked about in my video, seem to say like, yes, like this is there's like a real increase of the human nature in knowledge and wisdom. And I think the later scholastic tradition will nuance that a little bit more so as to avoid any notion that, Christ didn't have the beatific vision or something like that, to avoid that. Um, but I think, yeah, in that regard, I think Basil's a little more convincing. I don't know if we can just reduce it to a mere declaration the way Gregory would.
Yeah. I think the main issue, I think that, and I think why, obviously the Catholic tradition, right? It is dogma. You cannot hold that Christ is ignorant of the hour in his human intellect, right? When we talk about knowing the day and the hour, that is a perfection of human nature, right? Because we would say that we would exclude God's necessary knowledge from Christ's human intellect, but obviously
Right.
all of his free knowledge would be present, right? Because that doesn't pertain to like knowing the day or the hour. That isn't some kind of that's something that's not incommunicable, like when it comes to like divine attributes. Similar in the sense of like when it comes to Christ's assuming the passions, right? We would say that he obviously, right? I know you brought up like with the Cappadocians, what he did not assume, he did not redeem, right?
Mhm.
So in the same way, I would make my argument from the sense of that it's not necessary to admit ignorance in Christ's human intellect, just in the same way, like we can say that obviously Christ redeemed the passions, but obviously he only assumed the blameless passions, if that makes sense.
Right. The natural and blameless passions, as Damascene calls them. And we would also agree with the general principle behind it, which is that like Christ assumed the defects of human nature considered generally. But that didn't mean that he has to, for example, take on every bodily disease that man has ever suffered, right? Like it doesn't mean that Christ had to suffer from every mental illness or something like that. Um,
Okay.
right. So like Christ takes on human weaknesses, he takes on human infirmities, those that are consistent with the perfection and purity of the human nature. And my mic bumped a little there. But we would still, of course, agree with things like the beatific knowledge. Christ in his human nature sees the divine essence. He sees all that is in God. That include like the knowledge of the possibilities, or the knowledge of the possibilities, or the knowledge of the future is necessary and free knowledge. One of them, and um, and then further, we would also agree with the idea of an infused knowledge, right? So where Christ, the human intellect of Christ, the soul of Christ, has all of the intelligible species infused into it by divine power. So there are some things like that are unique in the case of Christ in the incarnation that don't threaten the reality of his humanity. It's more so like on the exegetical level, the earlier patristic reading that we would say our case is a little stronger, but still like not wholesale, throwing out or saying that Christ was just ignorant and his human nature simplicator. Like there's some distinctions and nuances and clarifications that have to be made.
For sure. Yeah. And would you say that, like, it seemed to me from your video that you were more, and I would concede this to you, that individual Catholic theologians who would deny Christ having acquired knowledge, like, I would concede to you that, yeah, that is problematic.
Yeah, I think, like, I was interested particularly with Bellarmine, because he's the one that kind of, Bellarmine is a figure that really made this a polemical point with Protestants in his treatise on Christ, in that big tome on the controversies. And Bellarmine kind of he doesn't really seem to invoke that threefold distinction of Christ's knowledge in the way that he explains Christ just not declaring the day and the hour. Like he doesn't invoke that, and that's surprising. It's surprising that he doesn't go there. Whereas like Aquinas, Scotus, they all do go there, and the later Thomists, Gabriel Vasquez, they do invoke that distinction. They explain it very thoroughly. So it's surprising that some of the more polemical writers like Bellarmine don't use that distinction. It's not to say he didn't believe in it. I'm not saying that. That'd be an argument from silence. But rather that it's strange that he doesn't utilize it, especially when it's on the very question.
Yeah. I haven't read St. Robert Bellarmine on this particular issue, so I'd have to get back to you on that. But
Yeah, for
yeah,
sure.
I think the main, like I said, I guess my main argument would basically be based on the fact of the perfections of that human knowledge would not be a detriment to, for what Christ assumes. But I think also which I found to be interesting, is I think when it comes to some of the earlier fathers, I think it's clear because when we use patristic consensus as a rule of faith, I think there is a clear distinction when you're looking more into when a particular patristic author is more delving into speculation as opposed to like, this is of the Catholic faith. And I would say that mainly those earlier fathers, that was not something that they were acting in that mode of they were teaching as of the Catholic faith, but more of their speculation as the individual error of, I would say, of admitting ignorance in Christ's human intellect was not something that was manifest as an issue within church history, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, I think one thing, I mean, Athanasius, of course, is the most interesting author here because he talks about it quite a bit in his third discourse against the Arians. And Athanasius, he does seem to speak of it. I mean, he does say, like, who among the faithful does not know the explanation of this text? Because the Arians were constantly throwing this, in our face, saying Christ does not know the day and the hour, therefore he is not consubstantial with the Father. There's something imperfect. And Athanasius says, no, you understand these things as befitting the humanity, as befitting the manhood of Christ. And he seems to maybe at least, he may not say it explicitly, to be fair, but he at least seems to imply that this was like a pretty general explanation because he says, like, who among the faithful does not know this? I have to go back and read some of the other fathers, like Ambrose, and see if they speak that way. But it seems like maybe it's like early 4th century, you kind of get this explanation. But once you get into like the 5th and 6th centuries, then a more kind of Gregory the Great's reading starts to become a little more prominent, especially against the Ignoetai.
Right, for sure. I do want to address this. I actually changed the title. I don't know if you noticed it, kind of as a joke. I said, two Calvinists answer your theology question, just because, the normie Catholics will always throw at the Thomists that, you guys are basically Calvinists or.
Yeah.
And it's kind of ironic given that and I really think probably the two biggest things like Catholic answers is like really bad on is predestination and then purgatory.
Yeah, I heard Trent Horn one time say like, yeah, the Roman Catholic Church completely rejects any reprobation, which was just insane. I mean, yeah, I think those are crazy takes, but historically, I mean, the Dominicans and the Reformed have kind of rubbed shoulders quite a bit on soteriological issues because the Dominicans' debates with the Jesuits kind of were a parallel to our debates with the Arminians, Remonstrants, with the Synod of Dort. So there is an interesting kind of parallel historical storyline there.
For sure. Yeah, no, I definitely see. I mean, because I've always pointed this out. I mean, the argument isn't over election, it's over perseverance. That's always what's been the issue at hand. But yeah, I do think a lot of and what really kind of disappoints me with a lot of these Catholic answers guys is like they've been in the apologetic space for like decades, and it just seems like they're just not familiar at all with the sources at hand. Like, the basic is just like, I mean, don't get me wrong, the catechism is great. I think it's it's a fundamental, nice beginner summary of the Catholic religion, but you kind of have to move past that eventually at some point.
Right, of course.
Understanding the Catholic faith.
Yeah, and we would say the same thing for our guys as well.
For sure. Okay, so this is known as the Calvinist dilemma, so I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this, Matt. Okay, so I'll read it. The Calvinist dilemma. If you deserve the consequences of your predetermined actions, then the saint deserves his salvation. Thus, it is not grace. And then I'll read premise 2 for you. If you don't deserve the consequences of your predetermined actions, then the reprobate doesn't deserve his damnations. Thus, it is not justice. Thoughts on this dilemma?
Well, first of all, I'll talk about the reprobation part first.
For sure.
You'll know why in a second. When we're talking about, because this is actually a common objection, which is how can reprobation exist not on account of sin? Like, wouldn't that be unjust? When we're talking about reprobation and the decree of predestination in general, election and reprobation, we have to distinguish. I'm sorry, I have a fly that keeps buzzing.
No, you're good. No worries.
We have to distinguish between the decree itself, like ad intra, which is identical to the essence of God, by the way. We distinguish between the decree itself and the temporal execution of the decree in time. So in reprobation, for example, when God, in the decree of reprobation, um, it is true that in the decree itself that is based on the sovereign will of God. However, the execution of that, like the actual damnation of someone to hell, is based on their deserved sins, which carry with it the guilt, a liability to punishment.
Right.
So in that case, reprobation is deserved when we observe the proper distinction. I don't see how God predetermining a person to salvation would infer that they deserve it. In the same way, I mean, does God choosing, for example, Israel as the covenant people under the old law, would that infer that Israel deserved it? No. Deuteronomy 7 makes it very clear that it wasn't because of anything in Israel itself that moved God as an impulsive cause to choose them. However, that doesn't negate the fact that God did indeed still choose him. So I think ultimately this argument isn't so much an argument or a Calvinist dilemma. It's really just a dilemma for anyone who holds predestination at all. I mean, whether if you're Augustinian, you're Thomist, you're Dominican, you're Reformed.
Oh yeah, no,
But yeah.
yeah, for sure. And I would just say, even with antecedent negative reprobation, right? That's just God's eternal decree that those who do not cooperate with sufficient grace do not receive efficacious grace. And I'd also just simply say that, yeah, we don't deserve salvation.
Right. Right, we do not.
Okay, so Joe, this looks like something for me. Thank you for the $5. Probably a dumb question, but does mediatrix mean all saints' prayers go through Mary? And if so, what's the point of the Hail Marys? So when we say in Catholic teaching that the Blessed Virgin is mediatrix, well, first and foremost, we're not saying that you directly have to pray to Mary to receive grace. We would say, so I made, this is actually my first video I ever did with Wagner on this topic. So the idea of mediatrix comes from the fact that in Catholic theology, since the time of Cajetan, we distinguish between the order of nature, the order of grace, and the hypostatic order. So when it comes to the concept of mediatrix, we would say because of the Blessed Virgin's, right, from her flesh came the flesh that is hypostatically united to the Word. Gary Goulagrange is a pretty good author on this. That she pertains intrinsically to the hypostatic order. Of course, it's not an absolute, right. So St. Thomas will use that he answers this, I believe, in Prima Pars, that the Blessed Virgin has a certain infinite dignity, but we would say it's relative, not absolute, unlike Christ's humanity, because we would measure a thing's dignity based on its proximity to God, right? Because Christ is the principal cause, right? The author of grace, that grace is communicated through his sacred humanity. We would say because of the Blessed Virgin's relation that she participates in that. And this also ties into different doctrines that would tie in from her being the second Eve, with her participation at Calvary, with the concept of the idea of that. I think the best parallel to understand is when we understand from the Catholic perspective of Calvary as the first Mass, Christ plays the role of priest and victim, and we would say that the Blessed Virgin plays the role of the laity, with her prayers united to Christ, right? I think a good commentary on this is St. Thomas's commentary on Colossians 1, where St. Paul talks about his sufferings being added to Christ's body. And so when we're saying this, we're not saying this, obviously there can be a heretical understanding of this, right? That Christ's atonement and passion was not sufficient in of itself. But we would say that her prayers were joined to Christ, insofar as in the same way that the laity's prayers are joined to the priest who offers up the Eucharist. But obviously that Eucharistic sacrifice is a complete sacrifice, regardless of the laity's prayers being united, just in the same way that the Blessed Virgin's prayers were united to Christ on Calvary. And so we would say that would be the role of the objective redemption. And then the subjective redemption would be the distributions of graces. So we would say it's more tied in with like mystical theology, with the idea of Christ as the principal cause, communicating grace through instrumental causes, first and foremost, the sacraments. And of course, we would say there is kind of a dispute among theologians on what kind of causality this is. This was kind of debated within the 20th century. But whether you hold to moral or physical causality, it would always be admitted that it is a lesser causality than the sacraments. So we would view the Blessed Virgin's role as a secondary instrumental cause, similar to how the sacraments derive their efficacy from Christ's passion. I guess if that answers your question. And okay. Hey, Garb, good to see you. I'm almost done writing my defense of Wagner contra Hedges. Hope he gets to read it. So
I will. Yes.
For sure, yeah. Garb has been like a day one fan. I remember he commented on my first video, and he's always been a good buddy of mine ever since.
Yeah, I've had the pleasure of talking to him a bit as well, privately over various issues. A little bit, we talked a lot about the papacy and Chalcedon for a while.
Canon 28, right?
Right. And then a little bit about transsub as well, because I did a thread recently on transubstantiation that's made some waves a little bit, and Wagner was gracious enough to write a response, and then I wrote a counter response, and looks like Garb is going to do a counter.
Yeah, no. Hey, dude, I have Wagner's phone number, and he's not the easiest guy to get a hold of, so you definitely would probably I'll give you props that if he found your thread worth responding to. Because a lot of the times I talk to Wagner a lot in private when it comes to like certain Protestants when they respond to him, and he'll just be like, well, I don't feel like responding because it just seems like they didn't even understand like the concepts of play or what I was actually making my argument in the first place. But I mean, the fact that he responded to you, I would say he definitely, I'd give you your flowers there. But yeah, because I remember I made a response to Sean Luke on the topic of invincible ignorance. And he has a lot of very like odd scenarios that he and it comes to me off of the fact that he probably needs to do some. I'll admit Sean is pretty well read in Catholic sources, especially I think he kind of showed that in his debate with Eric McCabe.
Yeah.
But when it comes to a general treatise in moral theology, I think it's quite clear that he hasn't done like he maybe has read specific passages from like St. Alphonsus or other moralists, but it doesn't seem he's had the foundation in reading like a general treatise on like the different kinds of conscience or culpability and moral acts. So to give an example, right? So he brings up an example, right, of an individual, right? They get drunk before they commit adultery, right? And even though they committed the act, right, before while drunk, right, while reason was suspended, of course they would still be just as culpable as if they did it sober.
Right.
So he gives another example, and he gives an example of an individual who drinks like a really sweet drink. And basically, right, they commit the sin of gluttony, and then they have a conversation like with an individual, and he explicitly says that the error is merely intellectual. And so he basically says that individual, if they didn't understand the argument that was supposedly supposed to convince them of Roman Catholicism, right? And because they drank that sweet drink and their mind was cloudy before they heard the argument, they would be as culpable, and they would have vincible ignorance. So the problem is that fails for multiple reasons. So the first reason that fails is because the general principle in moral theology is ignorance excuses insofar as it is an impediment to the will, right? If we have this married guy, right, in a private space alone with a woman, he doesn't necessarily need to be aware of the species or gravity of the sin, but obviously he is going to be somewhat aware of the fact, right, that he is going like getting drunk with a woman in a private space you're not married to is going to lead to some kind of sin.
Right.
And then the second thing is for that individual who gets drunk, right? He purposely put himself in a proximate occasion for sin without just cause.
So it's culpable ignorance. Yeah.
Right. It'd be culpable ignorance. Because like, for instance, right, like let's say even if he didn't commit adultery, he would still be just as guilty because he purposely put himself in a proximate occasion without just cause. Because when you purposely expose yourself to the danger of sin so there can be just cause. Like, so a common example moral theologians will give is like a doctor who has to examine the private parts of the opposite sex, right? That can be considered just cause. But obviously that would not apply to that case. And obviously it also does not apply to intrinsically disordered acts, right? You
Mm,
can't be
yeah.
there can't be a just cause to like put yourself in a situation where you're going to commit an intrinsically disordered act,
Yeah.
which obviously
So it's
adultery would be.
right. So it seems
And
like from or go ahead.
oh, so the only other thing I meant in his first example, right? He obviously doesn't have an awareness of this like conversation he's supposedly supposed to have, right? When he drinks like his sweet drink. So obviously he's guilty of gluttony, but his ignorance would not be vincible just because he had no awareness. And supposing the premise that that individual is it's just merely an intellectual error, right? Because obviously formal heresy, formal schism requires pertinacity in the will.
Like
Therefore, he would
obstinacy.
not be. Yeah, he wouldn't
Right.
be culpable.
Hmm. We would actually also kind of say something similar about material and formal heresy. That like being a formal heretic like requires a certain level of obstinacy and refusal to be corrected. An example like the Westminster Divine Samuel Rutherford gave the example of Peter, who for a while denied that Christ would rise from the dead. Now, so in a sense, it was like, was the Apostle Peter a material heretic for a season? Um, but the thing is, Peter inwardly was disposed towards believing the truth. It was simply a matter of some ignorance on his part and confusion and doubt. But ultimately, when he was corrected by Christ, then he accepts the truth. So, for being
Right.
like a formal heretic, there's like a level of obstinacy there, refusal to be corrected. You're not listening. So some of it can be pragmatic, whereas material heresy can be like, if a brand new convert says something like the Trinity's like a three-leaf clover because they just don't know any better.
Oh, for sure. And I think like overall in general, like if you like press like the average like Catholic or even like, in your tradition on the pews on like some like obscure questions on the Trinity or Christology,
Oh yeah,
right?
yeah.
And
They might
they
get in
have
trouble.
to answer. They're going to be a material heretic. You know what I
Right.
mean?
But well, that's one of the good things though about I mean, grace in its very nature obviously covers over those imperfections. Um, so and that's why well, obviously we have to have a spirit of charity if someone just doesn't know. That's always possible. Um,
For sure. Yeah. Okay. So this is a question for me, I assume. My friend external, because I know he's Lutheran, wanted you to answer this question. Since Catholics accept veneration, can we apply hyperdulia to the assumed man? So we're talking about Christ. No, Christ is owed one worship because of its hypostatic union to the word. He's owed
right.
the worship of latria. That
Mhm.
humanity, because of its hypostatic union to the word, owes latria. That would fall, to say otherwise, would fall under the anathemas that St. Cyril set out in Ephesus.
Yeah, one undivided worship.
But yeah, like what else did I yeah, I mean, I think with the kinds of I was actually have you read Baxter? Because I believe it, I think his name is Kyoto Reformed online. I know
Oh
you
yeah, yeah.
recommended Baxter on
Like, did he
different types
recommend?
of options.
Oh, like the Christian Directory.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I've read bits and pieces of Baxter there. When in my own personal life, I've been confronted with a situation of like, what do I do here? Like a case of conscience. Um, I think, I mean, I love Baxter, and I hope other Reformed people don't blame me for saying this. But sometimes I wonder if maybe Baxter can be a little too meticulous on some things. But I'm open to correction on that. I haven't read Baxter as extensively as some other guys. Um,
Mm,
when it comes to cases of conscience, I mean, I think first you have to have a proper understanding of how the conscience works. Um, so a good like I'm thinking a recommendation would be Samuel Rutherford from the Reformed perspective. Samuel Rutherford's treatise against toleration. And there he's arguing particularly against the Anabaptists who had the idea that if civil magistrates, if governments enforce true religion, they're infringing on the rights of conscience. And Rutherford is refuting that. Because of course he advocated for like like a Presbyterian Scotland, So he's trying to answer the tolerationists and the libertines who were so insistent on the liberty of conscience that it led to some disasters in early modern Europe. Um, and then when it comes to personal cases of conscience, though, like when it comes to different ethical or moral decisions, Baxter can be a very helpful resource. I mean, Baxter is a theological giant. Even if one doesn't agree with him on everything, I mean, you kind of have to. I mean, he's probably the most well-read in scholastic sources of some of the English Puritans. Um, so I think Baxter's good in Christian Directory. I also like William Perkins' just treatise on the cases of conscience. That's a earlier one that's also very good. He's more dealing though with like questions of like the case of conscience that the Reformed tradition has discussed a lot is the issue of assurance of salvation. Like how, because obviously we believe that it's possible for someone to know that they are saved. And so the question is, well, how do you come to that knowledge, and how do you answer the doubts that can arise? And then also like just lots of those kinds of questions that I guess would pertain to what y'all call scrupulosity.
Right, for sure.
Right. The Reformed were dealing a lot with that in terms of cases of conscience.
Okay. Would you distinguish between like because and I think this is a big problem for a lot of people is they often mistake a scrupulous conscience for a tender conscience, right? Because a tender conscience is a very good thing.
Right.
But the scrupulous conscience is the one that cannot make that firm decision. Is this a sin? Is it not a sin? So forth and so on. That's
Right.
more. And then another sign that St. Alphonsus will give somebody who consistently is doubting the validity of their confession, someone who's continually repeating confessions. So typically the advice he would give is that individual, you want to find obviously a priest who is, a vet. You don't want to find like a brand new priest who is a good confessor, and to submit to their judgments. And then also to not repeat confessed sins unless you have an or if you have a doubt on whether this or that is a sin, that particular moral act, to not confess it unless you could swear by oath that it is a sin, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. Big difference between tender conscience and scrupulosity. And that's Paul himself, the Apostle Paul, kind of alludes to some of that in Romans 14 when he's talking about Christian liberty, and the whole issue of meat offered to idols. So it is, yeah, scrupulosity is a problem for lots of people, both in Roman Catholic circles and in Reformed circles,
Yeah.
struggling with doubts. And when it comes to whether something is a sin or not, sometimes that can be done. Sometimes those decisions are made on the basis of prudence rather than like on a divine command.
For sure.
Such as when we're avoiding the appearance of evil so as to not give any occasion for the flesh, not give any occasion for sin, even though that thing may not be in itself per se sinful.
Right. A good example. Would you agree with this? To act on a doubting conscience with danger of sin would be sinful, even if the act is not sinful.
Yes.
Okay.
To go against conscience is neither right nor safe.
Yeah, because like in the sense of like, and this is the example I give. So let's say hypothetically, like you're in a desert in the middle of nowhere, right? And you find $100 on the ground, right? You have no reasonable opportunity to be able to find the owner of this $100 bill. But in your conscience, you are not sure whether or not it would be a sin for you to keep that $100. Right? You haven't resolved your doubt. Yet you decide. Now, I wouldn't say it's not a sin, but I'd say ideally you should give the money to the church. If you were to act without resolving your doubt and decidingly to keep that money anyway, you would sin, and then the gravity of the sin would be proportioned to your doubt, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the one solution, if like you really needed the money, we could also though say it's good to seek the preservation of one's own life. Like if that money could help you, for example, get water in the desert or food or something like that, it's still unwise to act on a doubting conscience because those are tricky ethical situations.
Yeah. We would
What
say
do you
when it
think?
comes, yeah. So the general principle with the doubting conscience is it's a sin to act on a doubting conscience when there is danger of sin, if that makes sense, right? With
Right.
the judgment. So, like, I'll give an example, right? Let's say you have an individual who is, they are not, well, let's say it's like the 1700s. They are not sure that Good Friday is a holy day of obligation, right? They have a doubting conscience on whether it is or not a holy day of obligation. It would obviously not be a sin to go to mass, right? Because you haven't
Mhm.
resolved your doubt. You're not sure whether or not
Yeah.
that it is a
Under
holy.
y'all's paradigm.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
The Roman Catholic paradigm. But obviously, otherwise, if you were to not go to mass, then you would sin gravely because the principle of right, the gravity of the sin is proportioned to your doubt, if that makes sense. Because the general principle is when you are purposely exposing yourself to danger of sin without resolving your doubt. Now, we would
Mhm.
say it has to be resolved. It can be it doesn't need to be absolute certitude, but a moral
Right.
certitude.
Yeah, it's good. I would say, yeah, you want to kind of resolve the doubt first. I mean, Paul does say like whatever does not proceed from faith is sin. When the context where he's talking about the issue of eating meat that's been offered to idols. So that principle, yeah, like you shouldn't go against your conscience, because even like on a a classic Western theological framework, the lower sensitive appetites, the lower part of the soul is subject to the higher reason, right? The will and the intellect are going together. They're not going to be in conflict with each other in such a way that acting even when you're going against your conscience would be wrong because that's a disorder.
For sure. If you don't, I have a couple questions here.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Question: given God's determination of all things, does that mean that we are unable to have avoided it whenever we sin, since God determined it to be that way? So I think here is the mistake here is not distinguishing between antecedent and consequent will, right? So when it comes to think about this is a general principle I think that we can all agree on. When it comes for the elect, the mercy of God precedes the cooperation of the creature. For the reprobate, their choice to turn away from God precedes God's judgment. That's a general principle that I think we can all understand, is that for that individual, right, who commits this grave sin, right, they have this would fall under God's permissive will, that he allows them to fall away. And that's how reprobation works, right? When it comes to God's even when it comes to antecedent negative reprobation, it's God's permissive will permitting that individual, right, and withholding efficacious grace from those who do not cooperate with sufficient grace. Because think of it like this: like sufficient grace by definition is simply the power to do the good act. All the efficacious grace does is move the will to perform the good act, right? It's what makes the good act accomplished. But yeah,
Another distinction that it's important to observe in this question, and this is one that the Reformed have made, and also the Dominican Thomistic tradition has made, um, is between when we consider a secondary cause or a conditional proposition, like if God predetermines A to do X, A will do X, right? We can consider the secondary cause, the creature, in two respects: what's called the composite sense and the divided sense. We're talking about a conditional proposition here. So if I say something like, yeah, if God, predetermines Bob to drive his car, Bob will drive his car. That is true. That is an infallibly true statement in the sense that, yes, there's the infallibility of the futurition of that thing that God has decreed because of the immutability of the divine will. At the same time, if we consider that secondary cause in itself, it still has Bob still has the potency to not drive his car even as he's driving his car, right? I think it was Aristotle that in his treatise on interpretation that gave the analogy. Maybe it's on interpretation, but Aristotle gave the analogy of like when Socrates is sitting, he is able to not be sitting. And the fact that he retains that potency to not be sitting is what makes his action of sitting contingent and free, and therefore not absolutely predetermined in the sense of a necessity of the consequent, where it's like an absolute infallible necessity of nature, like the necessity by which fire burns, um, or something like that. So the fact that we have this simultaneity of potencies is what grounds the contingency of secondary causes, and therefore guards us against a sort of fatalistic understanding of predestination.
for sure. There's one other question that pertains to this. I just want to use the bathroom really quick, if you don't mind. This, I think, I mean, you basically kind of answered it, but basically, question: how is it just for God to elect some people to be damned with no opportunity to be saved? Doesn't this conflict with God's desire that all be saved? I'll be right back.
Sure. Yeah. To answer briefly, we also distinguish between the will of sign and the decree ad intra. And we do believe that there is a genuine will of God to save all. I would recommend reading John Davenant on that particular question. And I also am going to use the restroom real quick. I'll be right back.
Hey, Matt. Oh. Assume Matt went to the bathroom. So this is a question that I can answer here. Question: why is Pope Leo XIV so based? What is the charism of safety in the papacy? Lofton writes about it. So the charism of safety. So this is kind of a disputed topic. Basically, the idea of, so when we're talking about the Pope and his non-infallible magisterium, the non-definitive magisterium, pretty much all theologians will concede that the Pope can err in his non-definitive magisterium. So the big question is it possible for the Pope to teach heresy in his non-definitive magisterium? So that's where the charism of safety comes into play. I don't really have a strong opinion on this. Like I said, I would say that the Pope can err in his non-definitive magisterium. You have different theories that various Catholic theologians will give on this topic. Some will say that, like, yeah, I'd have to look into this more to answer sufficiently. But basically, the idea of infallible safety is that the Pope cannot teach heresy in his non-definitive magisterium. However, pretty much virtually all Catholic theologians concede that they can err, because there's a difference between error and then actual heresy. If you understand the different theological notes, we can virtually all Catholic theologians will say it's obviously possible for the Pope to err in his non-definitive magisterium. It's a disputed topic on whether it's possible for the Pope to proclaim heresy in the non-definitive magisterium. Generally, I would say, I don't really have a strong opinion on this, but I would say that if that were to hypothetically happen, it would just be deemed non-magisterial. Because if you understand the nature of obsequium religiosum, right, it does not fall under divine faith. It falls under the virtue of obedience, or the natural virtue of religion, right? It's not, it doesn't fall under a theological virtue. So, and that's why the assent is conditional. So it is, and the reason is you cannot affirm two contradicting propositions. So in that situation, you would give your assent to the higher weight teaching. So that's the general principle when it comes to the non-definitive magisterium. Obviously, there's controversial issues on this. Probably capital punishment is the one everyone wants to talk about. But I don't want to be accused of being called a moral schismatic again for just admitting a principle that literally all Catholic theologians use. Funny enough, I'll tell you about this, Matt. So basically, Eric called me or he said that I'm a moral schismatic because I made a video specifically calling him out for teaching heresy, because he was saying that an atheist can have implicit faith.
Oh, wow.
And I mean, it's just absurdly heretical. I think this is something we can all agree on, that this is this is just objectively. And I go in detail explaining how his view would contradict Trent, Vatican I, and like in just this absurd reading of Vatican II, how it of Lumen Gentium in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Because we would say, and this has a very strong foundation from the time of St. Thomas, that if you have this like take like the Native Americans, right? If they were truly invincibly ignorant of the Catholic religion, right? And they were living according to the dictates of conscience, we would say they'd either be sent a preacher or receive an internal illumination so they can make a supernatural act of faith. Because obviously that supernatural act of faith is a necessity of means per se. It cannot be dispensed. And by definition, like, if you do not, I mean, what is faith? It's an assent of the intellect based on the trustworthiness of testimony, right? If you don't affirm the agent who presents his testimony explicitly, how can you give an intellectual assent to said testimony from that agent? So, I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous. So I felt the need to put out a public correction. And basically his response was, I didn't watch the video, and because of your stance on capital punishment, you're a moral schismatic, even though that's not even a category that any Catholic theologian uses. It's just it's a made up term. But yeah. Where does one read about scrupulosity? I'd recommend St. Alphonsus, book 1 of the Theologia Moralis. He goes over the different kinds of conscience, and then he gives advice for confessors when it comes to the role of conscience. But I mean, any good manual in moral theology is going to cover like advice for a scrupulous conscience. But I would recommend St. Alphonsus's Theologia Moralis because that's kind of like the summa of moral theology, right? He's the highest authority in the church in moral theology. Like if you read any manual in moral theology, you are going to see extensive citations from St. Alphonsus. Let's see. I'll answer this. Okay. What if someone doubts about everything being mortal sin? Is he now stuck committing a mortal sin? Okay. So there's 2 exceptions to this. Okay. So that's why I gave the advice earlier for that individual who genuinely has that scrupulous conscience that they submit to their confessor, to their advice. So there's 2 main exceptions with the doubting conscience, right? So the first exception is obviously if you have that doubting conscience and you're not exposing yourself to danger of sin, that's fine. And if you're in like a circumstance where you have to make a decision, you would make your judgment on what is the least likely to expose you for danger of sin. And even if hypothetically your judgment was wrong, you did not have the freedom for formal sin. So I guess to give an example, let's say you're at the beach and there's like a woman who's drowning. Okay, so let's say, and this might sound absurd, but if you really talk to people who are scrupulous, like they have these very absurd like scenarios. That's a very good sign that someone does not have a tender conscience, but a scrupulous conscience. Let's say this woman is drowning, right?
Should you save her?
Yeah, should you save her? If you would have to like make that judgment of you don't want to immodestly touch her or obviously commit the grave sin of omission by not saving her life. Obviously, the right choice would be to save her life, even to act. So that's the main thing. So the main principle with the doubting conscience is why it's sinful to act on the doubting conscience is it's when you expose yourself purposely to sin unnecessarily. Like if you're not in a situation where you have to act or make a decision. Like in the book of Sirach, he who loves danger perishes in it. So that's why it falls under like why one should not purposely expose themselves to dangers of sin. That makes sense. Let's see.
Okay.
Here. Okay, I'll answer this. If both Mary and the saints are perfected in grace and perfect conformity with God's will, how does the prayer of Mary have more power with this prayer, say, of St. Augustine? I would say because she pertains to the hypostatic order, whereas all the other saints pertain to the order of grace. Let's see.
Yeah, I'm not falling for that.
Thank you, Eusebius, for the $2. Can Matt give a shout out to my friend Nick? And then we won't say the last name because we don't want to say that on accident. Have you seen the clip of Wagner? It was like a couple of years ago.
Yes.
One of his mods, DN, a very, very interesting individual.
Yeah. Yes, I've heard of this clip. I think Wagner one time said he thought it was a forgery. It wasn't, but it was a joke. Yeah, I've heard of that.
Yeah. Okay. Matt, are you a moral schismatic?
No.
Let's see. Question: can you define a moral schismatic? It's a completely made up term that Catholic
James White's his profile picture.
Yeah, no, Ignatius is a good buddy of mine. He's in my Discord. Okay, so just to like go over the different types of schism, there is a material or a formal schismatic, or you can have an occult schismatic or a manifest schismatic. So a material schismatic is going to be an individual who, we're speaking juridicially, would be someone who isn't in communion with the Roman pontiff. Obviously, I'm answering from the Catholic perspective. And then formal schismatic would be someone who pertinaciously denies communion with the Roman pontiff. For someone who is an occult schismatic, it just means that their schism is purely internal. If they are a manifest schismatic, it's known in the public forum. and a manifest schismatic and an occult schismatic, they can either be material or formal. So those are the basic categories of schism. Same applies to heresy as well. Yeah, so the idea of a moral schismatic, that's just a completely made up term. That's no Catholic theologian uses that term. It's just you can't just, when you're actually making these kind of judgments, you can't just make up terms that are not used by Catholic theologians. That's not a category at all. Let's see. But yeah, so I get what was I going to ask you next, Matt? So I know that I didn't read really closely, but you converted to the Reformed tradition 4 years ago. Did you were you always Christian, or did you convert from another religion, or how did you grow up in your household, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, no, go for it. So when I say converted, I don't mean it was like a significant worldview change or an apologetics thing. Um, it was like an actual conversion of like really learning, like an actual exercise of faith on Christ, and repentance, which I had not done yet. Even though I was very like interested in apologetics, interested in all the theology stuff, like on an intellectual level, I didn't understand it on a spiritual level. Or in reform terms, I had maybe historical or temporal faith, but not justifying faith.
Right.
I grew up in a household that was like, it was Calvinistic Baptist. So kind of not like, I guess, not like reformed in the proper sense. But broadly, I heard about the 5 points of Calvinism growing up and things like those kinds of concepts. But in 2021, it was actually very issues related to things like a tender conscience and scrupulosity that I was struggling with. And I really, really found a lot of help in reading the writings of the Puritans, who, of course, are very prominent in the Reformed world. And reading that was ultimately over time and understanding like what faith actually is, what repentance is, and what the glory of Christ is. That's what ultimately was my conversion. And then over time, I became more and more like strongly reformed as I studied some of the confessions, studied the Reformed scholastics, especially like I had quite a few of the volumes of John Owen in my library, very prominent Reformed Puritan. So those kinds of things were what really, really were like instrumental in shaping my theology.
Okay, for sure. I mean, to speak for myself, I was a cradle Catholic, half Filipino, half white. So, obviously I'm kind of stereotypically one of those ethnic groups that are
More
Roman
Catholic.
Catholic. Yeah. So I went to I had a strong desire for the priesthood when I was younger. I actually went to a minor seminary in the Philippines for a year.
Mm.
Did you ever see the video that kind of went viral of like this seminary in the Philippines of them like doing this like really like, I'm just gonna say gay dancing?
No, I have not seen that. Were you a part of it?
No, I wasn't, but that was the former seminary I went to.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and
Yikes.
it was, I mean, in Filipino culture, like that's, dancing and
Yeah,
karaoke, that's just kind of like part of the culture.
right.
It's just like it's something like, okay, there's nothing wrong with it, like, if you're at like a birthday party at the beach or anything, if you want to do some karaoke, but like if you guys are seminarians and clerics, please do not
Uh,
post that on the internet.
yeah, yeah, that's bad.
Yeah, and I would say in high school I kind of just fell away from the church, just mainly because of the fact that I guess hormones raging, and I didn't truly have a love for Christ. I think there was just something lacking in my relationship with Christ, and I also didn't have the intellectual grounding in my faith. So I kind of just I don't even know how to explain like what I was. I was just like,
Sure.
just kind of a whatever. It
Mm.
was just living in the moment, not thinking about what eternity is.
Well, that was me as well. Yeah. And but I outwardly professed to be a Christian, and I was interested. I remember I kind of got into it when I was 12 years old. So I was in between sixth and seventh grade at the time. I came across on the internet a lot of these Christian Muslim debates and Christian atheist debates. And that shook me for a while because I didn't know how to answer any of those kinds of objections from Muslims. Now those are like they're the dumbest objections in the world. They're very easy to refute.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
But back then it was intimidating, especially at my age. Um, and so, I kind of had a few months where I was just kind of trying to resolve some of those doubts very quickly. I wasn't reading a lot, just more watching online apologetic stuff. And then I kind of just went off, and did my own thing for a while. I was interested. I wanted to actually be a jazz musician. That was what I wanted to do. I played bass guitar for the school jazz band for about maybe a semester or two, something like that. So that was what I was really into for a while. And then COVID hit. And when COVID hit, having all that time by myself, being alone at home, then I kind of started to think about the direction life was heading a lot more, and and also thinking about eternity. But it was more of like, I guess to use your terminology, I had attrition but not contrition.
Right.
So I was worried about like I had stolen some things, and so I had to return those. Um, I even like I stole a Bible at one point from a church, and I had to return it. And that was not fun to do. It was pretty humiliating. But did things like that. I remember, kind of having a bad friend group at the time. A lot of foul language going around and things like that. I mean, how young guys at
Oh,
those
for sure.
stages are. So bad influences in my life, but I kind of started getting interested in apologetics again, more just for the debate stuff. Like it was entertaining to me. I mean, who wouldn't be entertained by it? But over time, I began to really, really notice a lot of problems, like in my own heart, in my own soul, in my life. And then eventually, sermons kind of started to come into my YouTube feed, which I think was God's providence. And even though like those sermons weren't always from like the most like astute reform people, sometimes it was just from like some Baptist guy. Still, I was convicted and concerned. And so, yeah, over time, I began to kind of, I think that was my genuine conversion.
Yeah. I think speaking for myself similarly, I think I came to a point where, prior to my reversion, right, I had a pretty stable job working at a lottery ticket factory,
Oh, wow.
girlfriend for 3 years.
Mhm.
And I've always realized that there was just something missing in my life. Like, I think probably to me, my favorite article in all of the Summa is it's Prima Secundae Question 2, Article 7, which is whether any created good can constitute man's happiness.
Huh.
And when I came back into my reversion, obviously I didn't think of like these like complicated like philosophical arguments for God's existence, or like Gary Gulagrange's arguments for like the Catholic position, or Shaven, right? That wasn't why I came back into the Catholic faith, but I recognize that there was always something missing that I was trying to pursue, right? As St. Thomas would say, as the last end. And I realized that happiness is not going to be in a relationship with a girl, or a well-paying job, a nice car, fancy clothes, but it
Mhm.
was a deep founded relationship with Christ. So that was something that I realized that there was something missing. And once I came back, started regularly attending mass, going to confession, and living in the state of grace, there was a certain at peace relief. And then slowly I started to get into the Catholic scene. Like when I first came back, because I've been back into the church for about 20 months now, so about a year and little over a year and a half.
Okay.
Like the first couple months, like when I was, because I had to assume apologetics content, like, I'd watch like the Trent Horns, the Voice of Reason types of guys, right?
Yeah.
Because I wasn't, I was still like a baby in like understanding the Catholic faith. And then, funny enough, Christian Wagner started popping up into my feed, and
Okay.
then that's kind of how I more wanted to focus more on the intellectual tradition of, especially from the thought of St. Thomas. Because I would say prior to maybe like a year ago, Wagner was probably like the only guy who was like actually presenting like the Catholic tradition, like from its intellectual perspective, beyond the
Right.
like beyond the like the silly stuff you'll see from Catholic Answers. Classical Theist is another good, but he's not very active on YouTube. But
Mhm.
he's definitely somebody who actually understands our intellectual tradition. Then Kevin started to come around into the scene because Kevin's only been on YouTube for about a year.
Yeah.
Uh, I had Wagner tutor me for a while. I'd met with him quite a bit for tutoring, and I think that's how I was
Oh,
able to
really?
advance in understanding the Catholic faith. And then, yeah, I was just like, well, obviously in that time, I was also discerning the priesthood. I was like, I thought it'd be a nice idea to put out my thoughts and like things I was studying in theology. I started with Mariology. I became pretty, Kevin watched my first video, recommended it. We became pretty good friends from there. Wagner and we started off as like tutoring, but someone he tutored me.
Yeah.
And eventually over time that actually grew into a friendship. And
Mhm.
then, yeah, I kind of just have been in the Catholic scene since then. I mean, I guess I would consider myself an apologist. Like I would say Kevin's channel is more geared towards like critiques of Protestantism. Like I'd say
Right.
that probably Kevin's probably the only guy who like consistently makes videos against Protestantism that's actually engaging with the sources at hand, right?
Mhm.
You're not looking at like the silly like well, how do you know that's the correct interpretation of scripture arguments that usually
Right.
like the
Right.
Catholic answer guys will put out. I mean, Wagner does too, but I would say his channel is not really geared towards contra
Yeah.
Protestantism.
I've always kind of thought of Wagner as kind of a jack of all trades.
Oh,
A
for
little bit like
sure.
he covers lots of different things. Whereas, Kevin's more geared towards polemics with us. And I like Kevin, by the way. I think he's a nice guy. Um, but yeah, I mean, I'm trying to remember. I think I first saw Wagner a few months after he converted. Um, like, like I didn't meet with him or anything. I just remember seeing him around on YouTube, like in like early 2023 before he had like really blown up.
Yeah.
Um, and so I remember seeing some of his videos at the time on like the Trinity against Muslims, and I thought he was doing great with that. And then I noticed at the beginning like he was very very charitable to the Reformed on some things, and I could be wrong if I'm misrepresenting him. He's more than welcome to correct me. Um, but I like early on I kind of noticed like, wow, he actually has read some of our guys. Like this is nice. It's kind of like a breath of fresh air, you know. So, and I think, and I'm noticing it seems like more guys on your side are starting to come to that kind of place, and that's good.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, it is kind of disappointing. Like you've seen like the announcement for like a lot of like oh the greatest Catholic minds and for Trent's conference and stuff. And it's just like
yeah,
it's quite disappointing to see that's
yeah.
what's like put out on the I mean, Kevin got
Right.
invited, so that's great. And then also
Oh, he
Gideon.
did to that conference.
Yeah, he
Nice,
did. Him and
nice.
Gideon. Those are like the two only Catholic apologists
Okay.
who I would say I
Yeah,
actually respect their content like
yeah,
intellectually.
yeah. I've saw one. I haven't watched Gideon much. The only thing I've seen was he did a debate with a Jew on Daniel 9's 70 weeks prophecy, and I thought Gideon just destroyed. I mean, he did. I mean, that text I think pretty much decimates rabbinic Judaism, proving that Christ is the Messiah. And so I did see Gideon's debate on that, and I thought he did good there.
Oh yeah, no,
And of
Gideon's a
course,
really sharp guy for sure.
yeah, yeah,
But he's one of those. He's kind of like classical theist, where they're more active. Like they're not really super active on YouTube. Like I mean, classical theist. He's been on YouTube for like 8 years. He debated
right,
Jay Dyer back in like I think like
yeah. I've heard of
2017.
that. Yeah,
Yeah. Though I mean, the thing with Jay Dyer is like critique his knowledge or what he knows or his arguments all you want. He does have a talent at the polemics and debating. Like that I
he
think
has
that's
good. I mean, he has good rhetoric. That just doesn't necessarily equal a good argument.
oh no, for
Um,
sure. That's what I
yeah.
mean totally. I think that's
No,
why a
I
lot of
mean,
guys.
yeah. I mean, I think Dyer's arguments against the Reformed are awful. Like he's tried to, like, for example, this was probably the worst blunder I've seen Dyer make was say that the Reformed believe that human nature, the human substance, is itself evil, like the way the Manichaeans think. No Reformed person has ever said that. Except, I mean, maybe there's like some modern, like pop Calvinist guys that say things that are akin to that, but like authoritative, like, Reformed sources don't say that. And, if Dyer's read as much as he claims to have read over these years, I think he knows that. So either he maybe just skipped over something or he's not being honest in how he represents the Reformed tradition. And same thing, I think, probably with how he represents Rome on some things. Like his arguments about divine simplicity are terrible. And I mean, it's just, and I don't even know if he accurately understands his own tradition on some things, like the essence energies distinction. Like there's a lot of people I've heard, even some within Eastern quote orthodoxy, that have said like, yeah, Dyer's view is not what Palamas taught about the essence energies distinction. So yeah, I've never really liked Dyer. I mean, he's funny sometimes, but like, um, and some of his debates, like the one he did, I think, was it like the whole thing on Muslims and Christians worshiping the same God? That was the whole controversy of this summer.
Yeah.
And that debate on capturing Christianity with Dr. Trent and Christopher Tomaszewski, something like that.
Yeah, that guy.
Yeah, that debate was pretty crazy.
Oh yeah, no,
Yeah,
Dyer's entertaining and he has good rhetoric. Like that's
yeah.
that's
Just not
about
good
the only
arguments.
credit I'll give
Yeah,
him.
yeah,
But
same.
I think like if you saw like Kevin's interaction with him when he called into his like Twitter space, I
Oh,
think that
Kevin
kind of,
interacted with him.
yeah, they had
Really?
I watched a little bit. He called in specifically with Nostra Aetate,
Mm,
and it didn't go the best for Kevin, but I mean, like I said, and I think I can understand from the perspective of like, not that Dyer's arguments are good, but I'm sure like
no.
you have to have a certain temperament to debate someone like Dyer. And like even if
Yeah.
like your arguments are superior and refute, he knows how to use rhetoric to like convince the audience you're losing, or perhaps, catch you off your guard. You know what I mean?
Right. And I mean, I've noticed there's some guys on the internet. It's like they have such a following that it doesn't matter how badly they blunder in a debate, their comments are going to say they won anyway. Like I've noticed that. Like, and Dyer is one of those people. It doesn't matter how badly he does in the debate. The comments are going to say he won, and that's why I'm just like, is this really even worth our time? I've noticed the same thing about like the atheist guy, Matt Dillahunty. He's kind of like that too. Like he's terrible at debates. I mean, he's kind of an idiot. Doesn't understand the basics of Christian thought on anything. I think he spent 1 year at a Bible college and claims to be an expert. And all the comments are always going to say he won. So that's why I'm just like, are the debates even like that productive? It. That's why I prefer like writing is probably a better means of communicating things. And I've called into Dire Space twice before. Once a few years ago, we were discussing Augustine's view of biblical perspicuity. He blocked me there. And then again we were discussing the whole thing about penal substitution, and he blocked me again. So I'm still blocked right now by Dyer on Twitter. But I think most people that call into those Twitter spaces get blocked.
Yeah. No, for sure. Yeah. I know that he's kind of one of those guys where like he's just like so all over the place. I did a stream a while back where he had like this like red pill dating advice video where I was just like I was just kind of
Yeah,
making fun of him, and like
yeah,
I'm not gonna. Well, I'm not even saying anything private. It's something he straight up said in the video. He was like
yeah.
talking about how this girl he dated, like after like 2 dates, demanded an STD test, and I'm like, dude, like you're presenting yourself as an apologist, and you're like saying this publicly in like a red pill dating
Yeah.
advice video. It's like absolutely
Well,
ridiculous.
I don't want to overstep my boundaries here, but I have noticed like, and man, this could get me in trouble. But it seems like in general, like I've noticed Dyer kind of has a more sensual personality. And I'm like, where's his? Does he have does his Orthodox priest approve of his online activity? It
Yeah,
seems like there's not much accountability for the Ortho Bros.
yeah.
Whereas like, yeah, whereas in
I've
like
noticed.
Roman, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Where it's like it doesn't seem like there's like a ton of accountability. Whereas like I know I've heard of talked to some Roman Catholic guys that are saying, no, my priest wants me to stay out of polemics. And I've talked, and there's other Reformed guys that are saying, hey, the Presbytery Synod would like me to step back from some of the online stuff. Whereas like with the Ortho Bros, they just like roam free, and it's like they're completely disconnected from like church life.
Yeah.
So, and I think Dyer's one of those people. And like Sam Shamoon, like does Sam Shamoon? I mean, I know Sam Shamoon has kind of like become Roman Catholic, sort of. I don't think he understands it very well, but I think he kind of thinks that there's like this broad apostolic Christianity thing,
Yeah, which is
which
certainly not compatible with Catholic dogma at all, for sure.
right. It's not compatible with no salvation outside the church. It's not well, maybe, but it's also not compatible with the way Eastern Orthodoxy understands itself. But Shamoon kind of understands it as this one big bubble. that he's a part of. But like, I think he one time admitted that he doesn't even like attend a mass regularly.
Yeah, I'm not
Or
sure of
something.
his status. I know Lofton has done some like stuff talking about his, but I don't pay too much attention to Lofton. And my
Yeah.
thing with the issue of no salvation outside of the church, right? Like they don't like the way most people explain it is basically them inadvertently saying that Vatican II overturned Florence.
Mhm.
Like, and like if you're positing something as absurd, like, oh, an atheist can have implicit faith, right? Like, of course, I would totally understand from a Protestant perspective, like, you wouldn't take that claim seriously at all when it, like, if you read like Cantante Domino, and then you compare it to like how apologists will try to explain, like, with Vatican II, with how it explains,
Mhm.
like, for instance, with like Lumen Gentium, like, and I've said this myself, like, obviously, and this is perfectly in line with Catholic magisteriology. I wish it was more explicit on the necessity of the act of faith, right? It'll say, like, after talking about the different religions, that they are preparations for the gospel, but it doesn't go into the necessity, or it doesn't explicitly state that there's that act of faith that's necessary, right? For the dogmas that would be required for explicit faith. I don't know why I just did that. So that's my, and I wish it was more explicit on that, but it doesn't see, it's definitely not to the exclusion of that necessity, right? Because they kind of just say, well, if they're invincibly ignorant and they're a non-Christian, right? Like, yeah, well, they have quote unquote implicit faith. But I think it's clear from our scholastic tradition, following the thought of St. Thomas, that for all men in the age of grace, explicit faith in the Trinity, uh, no man receives the beatific vision without explicit faith in the Trinity and the
Mhm.
incarnation. And I would just say, for that person who's invincibly ignorant, right, and they're living according to the dictates of conscience, right? Because obviously, if they're committing sins against natural law, they'll be damned for that. But that in that internal illumination they'd receive, um, they would be revealed the Trinity and the incarnation to make that supernatural act of faith. I'd be curious, like, would you? I mean, granted, I haven't looked into the Reformed on this. Would you disagree with that? Like the possibility of that, them receiving that internal illumination?
Well, one thing is that the Reformed do understand like saving faith differently. Like for us, it's not just the assent. There's also an act of trust, like fiducia,
Right.
that has to take place as well.
Oh, I'd
There,
also say that, yeah, obviously, right. With the
Mhm.
baptism of desire that they would have, right. I mean, it works ex opere operantis as opposed to ex opere operato, but they
Yeah,
would still obviously have the three theological virtues infused. They would receive an infusion of sanctifying grace, but not the sacramental character.
right. So, I mean, I haven't looked as much into the question of implicit faith in the Reformed tradition. Um, but I don't know. They probably would not have the same, like, because we would say that, I mean, since the ordinary means of grace and of conversion is like the hearing of the preaching of the word, and like God can sovereignly choose to what nations he will give that. So, like the Indians, for example, like American Indian, God for a while did not give it. Although, of course, historically speaking, it seems like Rome kind of got there first before any Protestants did in terms of like trying to evangelize Indians, like the Jesuits and whatnot. Um, but implicit faith. So, I mean, ordinarily speaking, they need the preaching of the word as like the means of grace. It's true that God, however, can save someone like with like habitual faith, even if it's not always an act. But when it comes to invincible ignorance, I'd probably need to look into that more before giving like a definitive answer on it.
Okay, for sure. Yeah, that's what I mean. Because, yeah, obviously it would be not just like the assent of the intellect, but obviously with cooperation of the will. So they would receive the three theological virtues with a baptism of desire. But from what I'm aware, there is a concept of baptism of desire within the Reformed tradition, right?
Sort of. I mean, it's if a person cannot have like we would say that what is condemning is if a person has like contempt for the sacrament. If they have contempt and they're purposefully neglecting it, then that's dangerous. Um, but we would say baptism is ordinarily necessary, but not absolutely necessary in the strict sense for salvation. Like there are exceptions that can be made, and even I think, but I sounds like even with the concept of baptism of desire in your own tradition, that's also granted.
Right. We would say baptism is a necessity of means per accidens.
Hmm.
I'm sure you're aware of the difference between the different kinds of necessity. So yeah.
Right.
So it'd be
saying.
based on the ordination of God as opposed to tied to the intrinsic nature of the thing.
Yeah, you're sounding like a Scotist a little bit. I mean, that's sort of what Scotus's view of sacramental efficacy kind of is, which is like a moral causality. And it is interesting that, and this is there's debate about like, is the Reformed tradition on the sacraments and faith more Thomist or more Scotist? I definitely think there is a strong Scotist element. And I mean, for example, like one of the arguments that the Reformed would make against like the Roman Catholic understanding of baptism is that how can a physical thing like water affect saving grace in the soul?
So an argument against physical causality.
Right. And that's basically the same as what Scotus says, except that Scotus will just put it in more, being the subtle doctor, he's going to put it in more scholastic terms. And his argument is that a supernatural form cannot be extended throughout a material thing like water. And it also says like the sacraments in aggregate, it takes time to say all the words of institution to affect what the thing signified. So there's definitely a strong like Scotus Reform parallel on sacraments and also on things like merit and good works.
Yeah, I know that. So I have been reading a little bit into Richard Cross. Really good stuff, by the way.
Yeah,
he seems to really tie into like that. The Lutherans seem to borrow a lot from the Thomists, and the Reformed borrow from the Scotus. But I mean, obviously, he's specifically talking about the context of Christology. But yeah.
Right. Yeah, when it comes to Christology, it's true. There's a strong. I think one area where you see like the Scotus kind of shine in the Reformed tradition a little bit is when they're explaining the human nature, like the en hypostasis. Because the Reformed would usually say, similar to Scotus, that the human nature, it's depending on the divine person of the Logos for subsistence. Whereas like a more strict Thomist account on someone like Cajetan is wanting to emphasize that the communication of the divine subsistence to the assumed human nature kind of becomes intrinsic to the human nature in a sense. That's the way Cross puts it. In fact, I do have Cross's.
Sure. I'll just be right back. I'm sorry, I drank 2 water bottles. I shouldn't have.
Oh, you're good. Yeah, go ahead. Looks like I'm taking over a stream for a little while.
Yeah, all right, I'm back. Just give me a second here. But yeah, so I definitely think that's. I do want to address the super chat here real quick. Daniel, thank you for the $5. How do you talk to a rad trad type who are always negative and hate the Novus Ordo? Closer I get to God, the more my love grows for others. So I mean, when it comes to myself personally, I attend the TLM on a weekly basis. I do think with a lot of Catholics, you have like 2 extremes, right? Well, they're not even really Catholic, but the one extreme, right, is you have the sedevacantist. And then you have the other extreme, which is like the Pope splainers. You know what I mean? Where they feel like they have to defend like every little jot and tittle that's not even magisterial. Like they're like, for instance, like I just think it's ridiculously absurd for Catholics to defend the Assisi prayer gathering. I think it's ridiculously absurd to defend it. It's absurd. I think the balance is to understanding, well, one, the different magisterial categories, and to understand there's a reason why non-definitive teachings are owed obsequium religiosum, not theological faith. So just being familiar with the tradition and then understanding, like, it seems odd to me is like you can look at like the moral failings of popes in the medievals ages, right? Most people are not going to defend that. But then if you see something like absurd, like the Assisi prayer gathering, they feel the need to defend this. And it's like, we can just objectively say that was wrong. Now it's not my place to impute sin to Pope St. John Paul II, but I can just objectively say that was wrong. So I think that's their balance.
or like the thing with Francis on the death penalty, like what magisterial category would you place that in?
Okay, so Francis's teaching. So it would be so there's a couple different names. Some people will say that it's merely a prudential judgment. So there's this kind of like people have this like so a lot of people when they read magisterial documents, they think that like Lumen Gentium is infallible, which is fine to say as a general term. But when you actually read a magisterial document, you actually have to like read it line by line. And in the same document, depending on the statement, it can fall under a different level of authority, if that makes sense.
Within the same document.
Within the same document, yes. So this is if you ever want to read something on this, there's an individual by the name of Father Bernard Luchin. It's called the Magisterial Authority of Vatican II. It's only 70 pages. It's a very in-depth look on like the different categories and like how to like actually properly read a magisterial document. So I could give you an example, right? So let's say you look at Ineffabilius Deus, right? Obviously, the definition of the Immaculate Conception is right at the highest level of the magisterium, right? So obviously, it's extraordinary and it's an ex cathedra statement, right? Because obviously, you can look at like the key phrases and words that are used to like that Vatican I will lay out. So when it comes to so to give you an example of like theologians will have different terms for it, but they all admit the principle. It's called obiter dictum or the pedagogical magisterium. So they'll say like for instance, like one of the arguments that Pope Blessed Pius IX will give is, obviously Genesis 3:15, right? And he will say that that it says she shall crush the serpent's head, right? And I'm sure you're aware of like the controversy with Jerome's translation on this. Mm-hmm. A Catholic would not be bound to hold to the fact that it says she shall crush the serpent's head. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And then, or like I did in my response to Sean Luke in Ut Unum Sint, I gave this an example. Like when he's like when St. John Paul II is like praising, like praying with like other non-Catholic Christians. Like I think he mentions the Archbishop of Canterbury, I think some like Lutheran bishops or something like that. That would not fall under even obsequium religiosum. You could just, that would just be as how Luchin will phrase it, like matters of like illustration, right? That wouldn't even fall under obsequium religiosum. It would be something that would fall under the category he uses is the pedagogical magisterium, or obiter dictum is another term that people use, where it's just like it's a matter of illustration, or like maybe like an argument or like a personal detail accounting, because the purpose of obsequium religiosum is like for one to like have a deeper understanding of the deposit, right? And obviously like Pope St. John Paul II talking about like praying with non-Catholic Christians, like that's not something that would fall under like faith and morals to like understand the deposit, right? Because de fide credenda, which is the primary object of infallibility, would be things that are directly contained within the deposit. So, divinity of Christ, the Marian dogmas, so forth and so on. De fide tenenda is the secondary object of infallibility. So this would be anything that is logically or historically connected to the deposit. So something would be like the canonization of saints. That would be something that falls under the secondary object of infallibility. So both of those can be taught either in the extraordinary magisterium or the ordinary universal. The only difference is just one rests on something being directly contained in the deposit, so it must be believed as divinely revealed. De fide tenenda is basically something that's logically or historically connected to the deposit, so it rests on the infallibility of the church, as opposed to something that must be believed as divinely revealed.
Yeah.
And then obsequium religiosum, which would be the non-definitive or merely authentic magisterium, would just be like teachings on faith and morals that can have that gives one a deeper understanding of the deposit. One cannot hold that the non-authentic or the merely authentic magisterium habitually errs. However, one can make an extraordinary circumstance based on it being at odds with a higher weight teaching, if that makes sense. And then you just have matters of detail that are like put in passing, like when you can read like if you read like a document on like ecumenism.
Mm-hmm. Are there like in Roman Catholic circles right now, is there like anxiety or concerns about like let's say like controversial things that Leo the 14th has had. Um, and I'm sure it's probably not as bad as it was with Francis, from my understanding. But like, is there a concern about like could these things go up in terms of their level of authority? Like some of these ecumenical,
Like
yeah,
with capital punishment or ecumenism.
yeah, things like that.
I mean, sure, you'd have some concern, but like even like I would just hold that that's not going to happen. I guess if that makes sense.
Yeah,
In the same sense that like I don't know, like if someone were to be like, well, what if somebody finds like our Lord's bones someday, like from archaeological evidence, if that makes sense,
yeah,
to where that I mean, yeah, you do have some cases where like and here's my thing, I look at like John the 22nd with the beatific vision, right, with 3 sermons. So it's not like with a lot of these pope splainers, when they like come into these like categories or like these oddball issues, they feel just the need to like, hey, like we have to absolutely basically kind of just have this sort of tunnel vision. It seems like a lot of them are just not willing to interact with like what is come in the past. They just kind of have this sort of tunnel vision that, okay, this document comes out, therefore we cannot read it in a way that synthesizes the tradition. But I mean, at the same
mhm,
time, like I think like, and obviously I can understand from a Protestant perspective on the outside looking in, which is why like, yeah, the whole infallibility argument or the whole how do you know argument, like, yeah, it's objectively dumb because anybody who knows
right,
Catholic theology knows that our theologians dispute over the interpretation of tradition, the interpretation of a magisterial document. But I think we can just all agree in principle that Holy Writ has an objectively correct interpretation. A
mhm,
magisterial document has an objectively correct interpretation, just like any other text. It's just put forward your argument for why any kind of hermeneutic principle, arguing from the fathers to support your argument, or the scholastics and whatnot, to why your interpretation is correct and this other person's is wrong, instead of just playing the weird "how do you know" game. If that makes
yeah.
sense.
I mean, the way the debate was classically framed between Protestants and Roman Catholics on this issue was like, well, what's the formal object of divine faith?
Yeah.
It was specifically in when the whole like the canon argument about how do you know the canon. The way it's starting to be framed more, and Wagner's played a part in that, is like how do you know that the scriptures are inspired?
Right.
Um,
The proper
and
act of faith to give it, to give the
right,
assent. Yeah.
right, and it ultimately kind of boils down to like what does the faith ultimately resolve into as its final formal object? Um,
Yeah.
and we would say it's of course God Himself revealing uh, the inspiration of scriptures. Whereas I think if, and you could correct me here, it seems like the more Roman Catholic understanding is that it is the testimony of the church with respect to us that is required in us for us to know like the fact of inspiration with divine supernatural faith.
So I would correct that slightly. So obviously we can both agree that the principle that produces divine faith
The Holy
is the
Spirit.
Holy Spirit, right? The grace of the Holy Spirit. What we're going to disagree with you on is on the sources of revelation, right? With when you have because we obviously believe in revealed truths outside of Holy Writ. So I think that's kind of Wagner's argument, is that within, and it's specifically with the New Testament, right? Because I'd actually concede Whitaker's argument that one of the main arguments I know he uses, that Christ and the apostles authenticate the Old Testament. I'd concede that. And I think Wagner, that's why he specifically said in his video that it comes to, when it comes to the issue of, it pertains to the formal object. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I just lost my train of thought.
You're
But
good.
what so when it comes to the magisterium, we would say it's the necessary condition that applies revelation, but we would obviously deny that it's the formal object, because if it was the formal object, then that would be completely circular reasoning. So one of the analogies, Gary Gulagrange uses this, Billoward, it's pretty common in our tradition. Have you heard the analogy of the king and his messenger?
Mhm,
So that's pretty much the, so basically when you have the king, I think Stapleton uses it too, from what I've heard. But
mhm. I think Whitaker uses it against Stapleton. So the Reformed use it as well in a different way, of course. Kind of saying that like the um, the messenger does not give like more authority to the king's message that it didn't have previously. Um, and in a way, I mean, we also would agree that like I think Francis Turretin, if I remember correctly, phrases it that the testimony of the church is an instrumental cause for receiving the scriptures as authoritative and as inspired. So even then, but it's saying that like the actual grounds of divine faith is something like the work of the Spirit itself, testifying to the inspiration of Scripture, and like the whole self authentication idea, which I think has some stronger exegetical grounding, like just from testimonies of Scripture. I plan to perhaps write something on it maybe in January this coming year.
Okay, yeah. Kevin and I have talked behind the scenes of perhaps doing a video together on because I've read parts of Whitaker. I know he's read a bit more. I've read LeBlanc a little bit on this.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
I think where the real disagreement is, because I actually had a little bit of not really a back and forth, but just a friendly discussion like in DM with Michael Potamadamus. I mean, he's obviously a Lutheran, so perhaps his way of approaching the issue would be different than the Reformed tradition.
Hmm.
So basically what we're saying is because obviously we would say there are two sources of revelation, right? And then the magisterium plays the role of the necessary condition that applies faith. So we would just simply say that it's not contained within when it comes to the fact of inspiration from the books of the New Testament, right? To appeal to the historical witness of the church would be either to concede a revealed truth outside of Holy Writ, or if you are simply making a scientific judgment, moving from effect to cause, then faith would be replaced with scientific knowledge.
Hmm.
If the more understanding, I guess, from what I've understand from the reformers, is that they simply make an appeal to the testimony of the early church, but they would deny that it's a revealed truth. And that's why I
Yeah.
think that's kind of where the canon argument is. And then what actually constitutes a private revelation. I think that's where the
Right.
actual
Hmm.
argument or debate is actually to be had,
Right.
right? Because if you see how 98% of Catholics phrase the canon argument, it's just like a weird how do you know, or it's just like an appeal to infallibility, right? Where
Yeah.
it's more along the lines we both agree the formal object of faith is the authority of God who reveals. It's just what our point of dispute with you guys is going to be is, are there revealed truths outside of Holy Writ? And I
I
guess
see.
that's where
Yeah.
the appeal is going to be is revealed in tradition, proposed for belief by the magisterium of the church. Because we would say, obviously, when it comes to um, the rational credibility of miracles, right? We distinguish between supernatural by substance and by mode, right? When
Mhm.
it comes to supernatural by mode, we would say that prepares someone to give the assent of faith, right? So it can be ascertained historically, right? Like for Christ's miracles, right? They authenticate that he truly is God. And then we believe those with divine faith, along with all the other dogmas of the church. But when it comes to an
Yeah.
essentially supernatural factor, supernatural by substance, that is only believed with faith or with the assent of faith,
Not
right? So
scientific certainty.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, and of course, as you know, one of the historic reformed arguments on this issue is what we call the papal circle, which is the whole question of, um, you understand the fact of inspiration from the testimony of the magisterium, right? As a necessary condition, as you said. But why should we trust the testimony of the magisterium? And the response I've usually seen, and I've seen this from Wagner, Kevin, and I think it's from Matthias Shaben originally. I'm not sure. Maybe there's other authors that have made it that I'm just not aware of.
Lagrange is I don't know if you've read his De Revelatione. It's not really a polemical work against Protestants, but if you read chapter 14 and 15 of volume 1, he gives a very thorough explanation of the Catholic position on this.
Right. So it seems like the whole argument, like the way Shaben kind of responds is to say well, if we consider the Gospels just as these historically reliable documents that testify that Christ instituted this thing called the church and that he gave it authority in matters of divine revelation specifically. And the problem I have with that is that I think that would seem to reduce the test, our belief in the authority of the magisterium with respect to, as a necessary condition for knowing inspiration, to be a scientific certainty, which is exactly what we're trying to avoid. Since the Gospels under Shaben's argument are no longer being considered as inspired documents, because that's the thing in question, rather, and so faith is no longer supernatural in its object. It's a scientific certainty and the historical reliability of this document. So part of the reason why I don't feel like shaven solution works.
Okay, so I guess to steel man shaven, right? That's why we would also make that distinguish between supernatural by mode and substance, right? Because obviously we would say that the magisterium cannot pertain to the formal object, but obviously it does pertain to the material object among the various dogmas that are believed. So when you use the analogy of the king, Gary Lagrange goes into this, is not only is, obviously the trustworthiness of the king is attested in the letter, but also the trustworthiness of the messenger, right? Because in the analogy, the messenger would be the church. And then that is what prepares someone to give the assent of faith. But then obviously, with the grace of the Holy Spirit as the principle that produces divine faith, then it is believed after evaluating, along with obviously scripture as a historical document, that it is believed afterwards with divine faith, right, that Christ established this perpetual institution.
Mhm.
So as the necessary condition. So insofar as we're evaluating it as historical documents to prepare someone to give the assent of faith, right? And obviously you have, Christ's, we can look at the extrinsic and intrinsic motives of credibility to authenticate Christ as, an authentic legate. So I think,
go ahead.
so yeah, when we evaluate the magisterium from that perspective, we'd be looking at, along with all the various historical claims. And then once one has that moral certitude based on, Christ's miracles authenticating him as a true legate, then it is believed with divine faith, along with the various dogmas of the necessary condition, if that makes sense. So we would say the formal motive and necessary condition manifest each other, but in different genera of causality.
So would you say the formal motive for believing scripture is inspired is because the magisterium has said so?
No, we would say it's revealed in tradition, but what proposes belief is the magisterium. If that makes sense.
So would it be just like an instrumental cause then?
Sure, I'd be fine with saying that an instrumental cause. I wouldn't say. Sure, we could say that. Yeah, I'd be fine with saying that, but it wouldn't be a formal object just because by which you believe, right? Because that's what the formal object is. Would be, like I said, the trustworthiness of God, right? The authority of God who reveals. However, we would just say that there are revealed truths in tradition as well as Holy Writ.
Right. I mean, if I remember correctly, I think the way Bellarmine puts it is that like scripture has this authority in itself. It's not like the magisterium makes scripture inspired or something like that.
Oh, no, that's why I said it's the proposer.
Right. But that with respect to us, we have to have it like as something as a necessary condition. I guess my problem with that is that if we consider the nature of what authority is, it seems a little bit almost redundant to distinguish authority like authority per se and authority quo nos. Authority in itself, authority with respect to us, because authority by its very nature has an object, like it's referential at least, So like, does a king have authority if he doesn't have any subjects, right? And so in the same way, that's why I don't know. That's why I don't feel like Bellarmine's argument works because I think it makes a distinction that doesn't actually work for the specific concept of a thing as being like authoritative and binding. Because binding implies something that's bound and one that is binding, right? Agent and a patient almost.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely do appreciate this conversation on this topic because if I do make a video on this, I definitely would want to hear some more, like a smarter Protestant to give some objections for sure to think about. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. I heard there's one treatise I plan on reading from John Owen called "The Reason of Faith," and the other one is a Scottish Reformed divine, lesser known, but by the name of Robert Barron, wrote originally in Latin "Disputation on the Formal Object of Faith," and he's particularly going after Roman Catholic writers like Bellarmine. Also, he's going after Suarez, Gabriel Vasquez. And like John Capriola. So he's kind of going after like the Thomists and the Jesuits. Like those are the people in his crosshairs there as he's trying to defend the Reformed position on the inspiration of Scripture and how we know the inspiration of Scripture.
Yeah.
And I think one way to put it is that like, is that internal testimony of the Holy Spirit sufficient to produce an act of divine faith? And if not, then why not? I guess that's one way we could frame it. But
I'm curious, have you read any Lutheran authors on this and do they have a different approach or is it about around the same kind of argumentation?
I haven't. I mean, I've heard of like. I mean, I saw a video from Michael Pomatomatus or whatever. I can't say his
Yeah.
last name. My life depended on it. But he was quoting some Lutheran guys like Gerhardt. And I'd have to go back and watch it, but I've read more of the Reform stuff on it, like Owen and Robert Barron, and I plan on doing some reading of LeBlanc as well. But I've heard people say that Robert Barron, like his treatise is like 800 pages,
Yeah.
but it's considered like the best like treatment of the Reform position.
Okay, interesting. I'll definitely take a look into that for sure. But before we close out here, would you want to plug anything before I end the stream here?
Plug like some links or something.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh yeah, here I'll put a link to my blog or something. There we go. I guess I'll just put it in the public comment section right here.
Okay, I got you.
There we go. Okay, I think they got it.
Alrighty then. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this discussion. I may do more Q&As in the future. It depends on I guess my schedule and what I have planned on doing. I am streaming with the other Paul and Anglican Acolyte tonight on the ethics of apologetics. So hopefully you guys enjoy that. That'll be on the Anglican Acolytes channel. So I hope you enjoy the stream and this discussion. I'd love to have you on another time, Matt. I think you're, like I said, definitely one of the smarter Protestant apologists, and I definitely would appreciate to actually interact with more like sophisticated arguments. Because like, sometimes I'll have guys like I've had like, oh, why don't you respond to like needgod.net or something? Like,
yeah.
That's a waste.
Don't waste your time.
Oh, for sure. But yeah, definitely appreciate it, dude. I hope you all take care. Have a happy Halloween, and God bless.
God bless.